the self, and it is of two kinds. Number one, necessary extrinsic fear. So it is that agitation brought about by the outside forces of nature. Kuan man ka na kinahanglan ni siya kay para at least we are ang atong self protective instinct mo increase, no? Necessary tungod sa mga forces of nature kanang bagyo mayana, no? So hadlok mo na pero it is necessary extrinsic fear. Number two, extrinsic fear. It is the agitation that proceeds from the free will of another person. Okay. So, what is the moral principles concerning fear? Fear diminishes the voluntary nature of an act. An act done out of fear or because of fear is in one way simply voluntary and in another way conditionally voluntary. So what is the moral responsibility? Well, the moral responsibility is of lower degree. As I have said, fear diminishes the voluntary nature of an act. So voluntariness is one of the important determinants of morality as we have discussed already. Okay, so that's fear. Now let us proceed to the fourth modifier, which is violence. What is violence? It is an external force, physical, applied by someone on another in order to compel him to perform an action against his will. So there are two types of violence. One is perfect violence and the other one is imperfect violence. When we speak of perfect violence, it is the type of violence in which the victim gives complete resistance to the application of external force. So there are two types of perfect violence: physically perfect violence and morally perfect violence. Physically perfect violence is a type of violence in which the victim uses every possible means of resisting at the command of his will, while morally perfect violence is that which the victim makes use of all powers of resistance that can be employed. So that's perfect violence. Imperfect violence is the type of violence in which sufficient resistance is not exerted despite the available opportunity and capacity to terminate violence. No? So, mo na ang difference between the two. So, what is the moral principles concerning violence? If an act that is done from perfect violence is then it is entirely involuntary, no? If an act that is done from perfect violence. So in such case, there is no moral responsibility. Okay? While in imperfect violence, if the act is done under the influence of imperfect violence, then although it is less voluntary, so the moral responsibility is also lessened but not taken away completely, unlike in perfect violence. Okay? So that's when we speak of violence. As I have said, there are other factors affecting the voluntary nature of human act. And one of them is what we call habit. What is habit? It is an inclination to perform some particular action acquired by repetition and characterized by decreased power of resistance and an increased facility of performance. It is a stable super added to a faculty positively inclining a person to act in a certain way. It is often referred to as second nature, and it is synonymous to addiction, dependability, fixation, obsession, tradition, or pattern. So, what is the moral principle concerning habit? Habit does not destroy the voluntary nature of a human act. A person is at least in some way responsible for acts done from habit as long as the habit is consciously allowed to endure. So, in performing an act through habit, that particular act may not be completely voluntary in itself, but it is at least voluntary in a sense that the habit was freely performed by the repetition of several previous acts. No? So, mo na ang habit, ang habit na kay bad habits. Kunya, kung nag-exert kag effort nga, dili na nimo buhaton, that means you are actually escaping from committing a moral responsibility. No? So, that's habit. Now, the second other factors that affects the voluntary nature of a human act is what we call temperament. So, what is temperament? It is a human person's disposition. It is the sum total of those qualities which mark an individual. It is both hereditary and environment that plays a part in forming a person's temperament. So what is the moral principle concerning temperament? A person's in temperament can affect his will to the extent of somewhat lessening the completely voluntary nature of his actions. So these two are just a other factors. No? Okay. In conclusion, talking about last week's discussion and today, I'll make that conclusion in this topic for week 1 and week 3 because they are connected. In conclusion, we must this one we must be careful or cautious in rendering moral judgment. Placing judgment upon objective morality of a human act in the concrete involves a consideration of all the conditions which affect the morality of the human act. No? Itong ignorance, fear, violence, passion, habit, temperament, and the nature of the act itself, and also the purpose of the act and the circumstances. So all of this, you daghan kay kag bantayan, no? The nature of the act, the purpose or intention, the circumstances, and the modifiers that we have just discussed. These are all the things that you have to keep in mind in making a correct moral judgment. So we are warned that everyone has a conscience, but everyone also has a duty of enlightening his conscience. A particular caution must be given, rendering the judging of one's own case. In this regard, great wisdom is expressed in the old saying, no, that no one is a judge in his own case. So when an important personal moral problem presents itself, it is time to seek competent advice, no? Especially those who have studied moral philosophy, moral theology. They are the ones who are capable of making a correct judgment of a particular human act. Okay? So that's all for my discussions for this topic. If you have questions, feel free to message me. And thank you for listening.